On the night of February 9, 1934, a crew of workmen entered the lobby of the tallest building in Rockefeller Center, the crown jewel of a 14-building complex that had cost over $100 million to construct. They carried chisels. Their assignment was to destroy a mural painted by the most famous artist alive. The painting stretched 63 feet across and 17 feet high. It had been commissioned by the richest family in America, approved by them, and paid for with their money. And now that same family wanted it reduced to rubble, not because it was bad art, because it was too good. This is the story of a wall. A wall in the most expensive lobby in the most expensive building in the most expensive city on earth. It is the story of what happens when the most powerful economic system ever built commissions a painting of itself and discovers too late that the painter has told the truth. The Rockefellers owned the wall, Diego Rivera owned the story, and when those two facts collided, only one of them could survive. Chapter 1: The Fortress That Swallowed the World. Before there was a building or a mural or a scandal, there was oil, and the man who decided he would own all of it. John Davison Rockefeller founded the Standard Oil Company in Cleveland, Ohio in 1870. At the time, he controlled roughly 4% of American oil refining. Within 9 years, he controlled 90%. He did not achieve this through superior product or technological innovation. He achieved it through deals, threats, secret railroad rebates, and the systematic destruction of anyone who competed with him. He bought rivals when they were willing. He crushed them when they were not. By 1880, Standard Oil was not merely the largest oil company in America. It was the largest company of any kind that had ever existed. The numbers stagger. At its peak, Standard Oil refined more oil than most nations produced. Rockefeller's personal fortune eventually reached $1.5 billion at a time when the entire federal budget was roughly $700 million. Adjusted for the size of the economy, his wealth represented nearly 3% of the national gross domestic product. No American before or since has controlled a comparable share of the country's total output. He was not rich in the way that other rich men were rich. He was rich in a way that bent the government around him. In 1906, the Justice Department filed suit. In 1911, the Supreme Court ruled that Standard Oil had illegally monopolized the petroleum industry and ordered the trust dissolved into 34 independent companies. It was supposed to be a punishment. Instead, it made Rockefeller richer. He held shares in every one of the successor companies. As each piece grew independently, his total holdings multiplied. The breakup that was meant to humble him became the single greatest wealth creation event in American financial history. Within 2 years, the fragments were worth more than 5 times the original trust. John D. Rockefeller became the world's first billionaire, but the money came with a stain. The public hated him. Ida Tarbell's 19-part investigation in McClure's magazine had exposed the railroad conspiracies and the ruined competitors and the small men ground under. Political cartoonists drew him as an octopus strangling the nation, and then came Ludlow. In April of 1914, the Colorado National Guard and private guards employed by the Rockefeller-owned Colorado Fuel and Iron Company attacked a tent colony of 1,200 striking coal miners and their families near Ludlow, Colorado. The battle lasted 14 hours. When it was over, at least 21 people were dead, including 11 children and 2 women who suffocated in a pit they had dug beneath their tent to escape machine gun fire. John D. Rockefeller Jr., who by then managed the company from his offices at 26 Broadway in New York, was widely blamed. Before a congressional committee, he had declared that his company would fight unionization at any cost. A congressman asked him, "Even if it costs all your property and kills all your employees?" Rockefeller said yes. The massacre became a turning point, not for the miners who lost their strike and gained nothing. For the Rockefellers who realized that all the money in the world could not buy back a name associated with burning children alive. Jr. hired Mackenzie King, the future Prime Minister of Canada, to rebuild the family's public image. The project would take decades. It would involve universities, churches, hospitals, and one enormous building in the center of Manhattan. The son was not the father, John D. Rockefeller Jr. had been raised in a household of deliberate austerity. Despite the family's wealth, he wore hand-me-down clothes and received a modest allowance. He was shy, earnest, deeply Baptist, and tormented by the question of whether great wealth could be made moral. Where his father had been ruthless and unsentimental, Jr. was anxious and driven by guilt. He gave away fortunes to Rockefeller University, to the General Education Board, to the restoration of colonial Williamsburg. Every gift was a down payment on a clean conscience. But philanthropy alone could not repair the damage. What Jr. needed was a monument. Something so large, so visible, so generous in its employment of ordinary workers that the name Rockefeller would be associated with building rather than destroying. He needed a project that said, "We are not the people of Ludlow. We are the people who gave America its future." He found it on 3 empty blocks in Midtown Manhattan. Chapter 2. A City Built on Desperation. In 1929, the Metropolitan Opera abandoned John D. Rockefeller Jr., leaving him holding a lease on 3 empty blocks of Manhattan. The deal had seemed elegant. The Metropolitan Opera needed a new home. Columbia University owned a tract of underused land between 48th and 51st Streets, from 5th Avenue to 6th. Rockefeller agreed to lease the land for 87 years at $3 million per year and build the Opera House as the centerpiece of a grand commercial development. In December of 1928, the Metropolitan Square Corporation was formed to manage the project. The architects were hired, the vision was approved, then the stock market crashed. On October 29, 1929, the Dow Jones Industrial Average fell nearly 13% in a single day. Within weeks, billions of dollars in paper wealth had vanished. The Metropolitan Opera, which had never been financially robust, could no longer afford to move. On December 6, 1929, the plans for the new Opera House were abandoned completely. The Met withdrew, the architects stood idle, and John Rockefeller Jr. found himself committed to paying $3 million every year for a massive piece of empty land in the middle of a financial catastrophe. Most men would have walked away. Jr. could not. The lease was binding. Columbia University would reclaim the land if he defaulted, and he would lose everything already invested. More importantly, walking away was not in his character. He was a Rockefeller. Rockefellers did not retreat from problems. They built over them. Within a month, new plans emerged. The Opera House was gone. In its place, Jr. envisioned what he called a city within a city, a complex of commercial towers anchored by the Radio Corporation of America, which would lease 1 million square feet of space and give its name to the tallest building in the development. RCA President David Sarnoff recognized immediately that the project could reshape the radio and emerging television industries. By May of 1930, the deal was signed. The project was alive. The scale was breathtaking. 14 original Art Deco buildings would rise from a site spanning 6 full city blocks. Before a single foundation could be poured, 228 existing structures had to be demolished, and 203 separate leases bought out. Construction formally began on July 22, 1931, in the deepest trough of the Great Depression. By 1933, 1/4 of all Americans were unemployed. In New York City, the numbers were worse. 750,000 people had no work. Into this despair, Jr. poured money. Over 40,000 workers were employed across the decade of construction. The payroll circulated through a paralyzed city like a blood transfusion. Iron workers earned roughly $15 a day, the equivalent of $330 today. They climbed steel beams 850 feet above the street with no safety harnesses, no hard hats, no fall protection of any kind. A single misstep meant death. The famous photograph, Lunch Atop a Skyscraper, taken on September 20, 1932, shows 11 men eating their midday meal on a bare girder 69 stories above the ground. It was a publicity stunt. The danger was real. The total cost of the original Rockefeller Center complex reached approximately $102 million. In Depression-era terms, this was an almost incomprehensible sum. Jr. financed it partly through a $65 million mortgage from the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company, and partly by selling his depreciated Standard Oil shares, which had fallen from $80 to $2 per share. He was liquidating his inheritance to build a monument. He was betting that the name Rockefeller, attached to something beautiful and massive and useful, could outlast the name Rockefeller attached to burning tents and dead children. The complex also needed art. Jr. believed that architecture without ornamentation was architecture without soul. He commissioned sculptures, reliefs, murals, and mosaics from dozens of artists. The lobby of the RCA building, the crown jewel of the entire development, would receive the most important commission of all, a monumental mural on its Great Wall. The theme was to be New Frontiers. The painting was to show humanity at a crossroads, choosing between the old world and the new. It was to be hopeful. It was to be grand. And above all, it was to celebrate the future that American capital was building, even as the economy lay in ruins. The question was who would paint it. The answer would begin with a mother's taste in art and end with men carrying chisels through the lobby in the dark. Chapter 3. Hiring the enemy to paint the temple. The decision that would humiliate the Rockefeller family began as a mother's enthusiasm for a communist's sketches. Abby Aldrich Rockefeller was not her husband. Where Jr. was cautious and conventional, Abby was curious, adventurous, and drawn to modern art with a passion that made her one of the most important collectors in America. She was a founder of the Museum of Modern Art. She bought works that Jr. would never have hung in their home. And among the artists she admired most was a 300-pound Mexican communist who painted workers and revolutions on the walls of government buildings. Diego Rivera was, in 1932, arguably the most famous living artist on Earth. His retrospective at the Museum of Modern Art in December of 1931 had drawn enthusiastic reviews and massive crowds. He had painted murals in San Francisco, at the California School of Fine Arts and the Pacific Stock Exchange. He had just completed a monumental series at the Detroit Institute of Arts, commissioned by Edsel Ford, that celebrated the power of industrial labor with a frankness that thrilled some viewers and horrified others. He was a Cubist trained in Paris alongside Picasso. He was a committed Marxist who had joined the Mexican Communist Party, been expelled for ideological deviation, and continued painting revolutionary content regardless. He was flamboyant, enormous, famously unfaithful to his wife Frida Kahlo, and utterly without apology for anything he had ever done. He was also irresistible to the rich. This was the contradiction that defined Rivera's career in America. The same ruling class he painted as oppressors could not stop inviting him to their parties and paying him to decorate their buildings. He charmed Edsel Ford. He charmed Abby Rockefeller. He charmed her son Nelson, who at 23 was already building his own collection of Mexican art, and who saw in Rivera the kind of bold, creative vision that excited him far more than his father's cautious Baptist sensibilities ever could. Nelson Rockefeller wanted the lobby mural to announce that Rockefeller Center was not just a real estate development, it was a cultural statement. He and the architects initially approached Picasso and Matisse. Both refused. Picasso rejected the premise outright. Matisse politely declined, noting that the specifications did not match his style. Rivera, by contrast, was available and eager. He needed money. His Detroit murals had generated controversy, and American commissions were growing harder to secure. A commission from the Rockefellers would validate his place in the American art world and, paradoxically, prove to his critics on the left that a Marxist could operate inside the belly of capitalism without being digested. The Rockefellers knew exactly what they were hiring. Rivera's politics were not a secret. His sketches were explicitly political. Clifford White, Rivera's principal assistant, kept a copy of the plan. It was 2.5 pages of closely typed English, framed entirely in communist terms. According to White, Abby Rockefeller reviewed the sketches and said that Rivera had not given communism enough importance. She reportedly suggested he include a portrait of Lenin. Whether that detail is precisely true or merely a story Rivera's circle told, what is certain is this: the Rockefellers approved the sketch. The theme was announced as man at the crossroads looking with hope and high vision to the choosing of a new and better future. The contract was signed in November of 1932 with Todd Robertson and Todd Engineering, the development agents. Rivera's fee was $21,000. For context, the building it would decorate cost over $70 million. The approved sketch showed a worker at the center of the composition, flanked by images of capitalism on one side and socialism on the other. It showed lenses and microscopes revealing both cosmic and biological worlds. It showed soldiers and gas mason marching workers. It was, from the beginning, a painting about the choice between two systems. The Rockefellers approved it because they believed the painting would ultimately affirm their system. Rivera signed it because he believed it would affirm his. Both sides walked away from the contract convinced they had won. The sketch was pinned to the wall. The plasterers began preparing the surface, and every party involved operated under the same dangerous assumption, that they could control what happened next. What none of them understood was that a mural is not a sketch. A sketch is a promise. A mural is the truth. Chapter 4, 63 Feet of Revolution in Wet Plaster. Rivera painted directly into the wall, fusing pigment to plaster, making every brushstroke as permanent as the building itself. This is the technical reality that would determine everything that followed. True fresco is not paint applied to a surface. It is pigment ground into wet lime plaster, bonding chemically as the wall dries. Once set, the color becomes part of the wall's molecular structure. You cannot scrape it off. You cannot paint over it and call the problem solved. The only way to remove a true fresco is to remove the wall. Rivera understood this. He had been painting in true fresco for over a decade, and he knew that the medium gave the artist a power that no canvas painting could match. A canvas can be rolled up and stored in a closet. A fresco is architecture. It occupies the same space as the building, breathes with it, ages with it. To destroy it, you must wound the building itself. This was not an inconvenience for Rivera. It was the point. He wanted the mural to be as permanent as the Rockefeller fortune, as inseparable from the lobby as the marble floor and the bronze elevator doors. He arrived with a crew of 6 assistants, including Ben Shahn, Lucien Bloch, and his principal technical assistant, Clifford White. They worked from scaffolding erected across the lobby wall, 63 feet wide and 17 feet high. Rivera painted at furious speed, sometimes working 15 hours without stopping. He was racing against the plaster. In true fresco, you must finish each section while the lime is still wet, typically within 6 to 8 hours. Once it dries, the chemical bond is sealed. There are no corrections. Every brushstroke is final. The composition that emerged was staggering in its ambition. At the center stood a worker in overalls, his hands on the controls of a great machine. Before him, a giant fist held an orb representing the recombination of atoms and dividing cells. From the central figure, 4 propeller-shaped forms stretched outward to each corner, depicting arcs of light created by enormous lenses. Within these arcs, Rivera painted the cosmic and biological forces that science had made visible. Exploding suns seen through telescopes, cell forms revealed by microscopes. The message was clear. Humanity now held the tools to understand both the infinitely large and the infinitely small. The question was what it would do with that knowledge. To the left of the central figure, Rivera painted the capitalist world. Society women played cards and smoked at a nightclub table. Behind them, soldiers marched in gas masks and warplanes dropped bombs. Broken classical statues, a headless Caesar, an angry Jupiter whose thunderbolt hand had been shattered by lightning, represented the collapse of old authority. This was not subtle. It was a portrait of a civilization consuming itself. To the right, Rivera painted the socialist alternative. Workers marched together. Women exercised in athletic parades. Faces of multiple races held hands in solidarity. The mood was disciplined, collective, forward-looking. Between the two sides, the central worker chose. The painting was in every sense the argument that the Rockefellers were funding the construction of, a vision of the future. It was simply not their future. Crowds gathered in the lobby to watch Rivera work. Construction crews on their lunch breaks came to stare. Office workers from the upper floors rode the elevators down to observe the spectacle of a famous man making something enormous. Rivera was theatrical on the scaffold, massive and magnetic, gesturing with brushes and shouting instructions to his assistants in a mix of Spanish and English. He told stories about Mexico, about Picasso, about the revolution. He ate enormous lunches on the scaffolding platform, refusing to descend. The lobby became a daily performance, and the audience was riveted. The mural's theme had been dictated by the Rockefellers through their development agents. Man at the crossroads, looking with hope and high vision to the choosing of a new and better future. Rivera took the title literally. His painting depicted a man at a literal crossroads, forced to choose between two visions of society, two uses of technology, two possible futures. One path led to war, disease, and the concentration of wealth in idle hands. The other led to collective labor, racial equality, and the mastery of nature through science. Rivera did not pretend the choice was neutral. The painting argued. Every square foot of plaster argued. The theme said crossroads. The painting said the left path. Consider the numbers that defined this act of creation. Rivera's $21,000 fee, divided across the months of work and the cost of assistance and materials, left him with a personal income of roughly $7,000 for a project that consumed his life for the better part of a year. The wall he painted on belonged to a building that cost over $70 million to construct, inside a complex worth more than $100 million. The mural occupied roughly 1,071 square feet of wall space. The ratio of Rivera's fee to the building's cost was approximately 1 to 3,300. For every dollar the Rockefellers spent on the painter, they had spent over 3,000 on the building around him. And yet it was the painting, not the building, that would generate the headlines. But behind the spectacle and the growing public fascination, a technical decision had already been made that would seal the mural's fate. Rivera and White had developed a system for making frescoes removable. They had designed a metal substructure that could be installed beneath the plaster, allowing an entire mural to be detached from the wall and relocated. Rivera had requested this substructure for the Rockefeller Center Commission. The request was denied. The construction specifications called for plaster applied directly to the wall at a thickness of 3/4 of an inch per standard building code. No metal backing, no possibility of removal. This meant that from the moment the first stroke of pigment touched the wet plaster, the mural and the wall were one thing. Rivera knew this. The Rockefellers knew this. And yet both sides proceeded as though the question of what the painting actually said could be negotiated later. It could not. The plaster was drying. The chemistry was setting. And in the lower right section of the mural, in a passage that had not appeared clearly in the approved sketch, Rivera was painting a figure that would change everything. Through April of 1933, the work progressed. Rivera's assistants mixed pigments and prepared plaster sections. Sean painted background details. Bloch documented the process with photographs when security allowed it. The lobby hummed with the energy of creation and the sound of wet brushes on damp lime. No one on the Rockefeller side had yet looked closely enough at the evolving composition to notice what was taking shape among the marching workers on the right side of the painting. A face was forming. It belonged to Vladimir Lenin. The most controversial portrait in American art history was being painted, one wet section at a time, into the wall of the most expensive private building on Earth. And it was already too late to stop it without destroying the wall. Chapter 5, the headline that lit the fuse. The mural might have survived if a newspaper had not told the communists exactly where to find it. Through late March and early April of 1933, Rivera worked under increasing pressure from both sides of the political spectrum. The left viewed his commission with suspicion bordering on contempt. Here was a professed Marxist, accepting money from the family that owned the coal mines of Ludlow, painting inside the Temple of American Capital. Communist groups in New York taunted him publicly. Members of the John Reed Club and other leftist organizations came to the lobby not to admire the work, but to challenge Rivera's credibility. If he was truly a revolutionary, they said, he was a strange one collecting $21,000 from the Rockefellers to decorate their palace. Rivera was proud. He was also at his core a performer, the taunt stung. They challenged the central story he told about himself, that he could move through the corridors of power without being corrupted by them, that his art served the revolution even when it hung in the homes of capitalists. The challenge was not new. He had faced it in Detroit and San Francisco and Mexico. But in the lobby of Rockefeller Center, with the building still under construction and the Depression grinding into its fourth year, the accusation had a particular sharpness. Millions of Americans had nothing. Rivera had a contract. On April 24, 1933, the New York World Telegram published a headline that changed the stakes entirely. The article, written under the banner "Rivera paints scenes of communist activity and John D. Jr." Foots the bill, described the mural's content in alarming terms and presented it as an outrage. A communist painting paid for by the richest capitalist family in the country, hanging in their own building. The piece was not exactly investigative journalism. The mural's political content had been visible to anyone who walked through the lobby. But putting it in a headline gave it a different kind of power. Now everyone was paying attention. The article accomplished two things simultaneously. It embarrassed the Rockefellers, who had managed to treat the mural as a prestigious art commission rather than a political act. And it energized Rivera's leftist critics, who now had public confirmation that their attacks were landing. The pressure on Rivera intensified. If the World Telegram said the mural was not communist enough to truly threaten the Rockefellers, then Rivera needed to make it more communist. If the newspaper said he was decorating a palace, he needed to prove he was planting a bomb. On April 28th, 4 days after the article appeared, Rivera made his decision. He sent his assistants to find a photograph of Lenin. According to multiple accounts, he said something to the effect of, if they want communism, I will paint communism. He began adding a clear, unmistakable portrait of Vladimir Lenin to the right side of the mural among the marching workers, his hand clasped with people of multiple races. This was the moment the story became irreversible. Rivera's assistants later verified that no portrait of Lenin appeared in the approved sketch that the Rockefellers had signed off on months earlier. The sketches showed a generic worker leader. The mural now showed the founder of the Soviet state. Whether Rivera had always intended to include Lenin and concealed it, or whether the newspaper provocation pushed him to an escalation he had not originally planned, is a question historians have debated ever since. What is not debatable is the practical effect. The most recognizable face in world communism was being painted into the lobby of a building owned by the most recognizable family in American capitalism. Rivera later claimed that Lenin had been implicit in the original design all along. His defenders argued that the sketch's political content had been approved and that a specific face was merely a detail. His critics, including some of his own assistants, acknowledged that the Lenin portrait was a deliberate provocation added after the contract was signed. The truth likely contains elements of both. Rivera was an artist who believed that art should provoke. He was also a man under attack from the left who needed to prove his revolutionary credentials. The Lenin portrait accomplished both goals simultaneously, but it also placed Rivera in an impossible position. Attacked by the left for selling out, he had now given the right a reason to shut him down. The newspaper had forced his hand, and his hand had reached for the most explosive image available. The mural was still wet, the plaster was still bonding. And somewhere in the offices above the lobby, the Rockefellers were about to learn that the painting they had commissioned to celebrate the future now contained the face of the man who wanted to destroy their version of it. Rivera believed that his personal relationship with the Rockefellers, particularly with Nelson, would protect him. Nelson had championed his hiring. Abbey had purchased his work. He had dined at their table. He assumed that friendship and artistic admiration would outweigh political embarrassment. It was the most dangerous assumption of his life, because Rivera understood art better than anyone in that building. But he did not understand what happens when a man worth hundreds of millions of dollars feels publicly humiliated by someone he is paying. Chapter 6. The letter that ended everything. Nelson Rockefeller called the painting thrilling in the same letter where he asked Rivera to erase its most important face. The letter was dated May 4, 1933. It was written on personal stationery, and it contained the contradictions of the entire affair compressed into a few paragraphs. Nelson began by praising the mural's quality. He used the word thrilling. He expressed genuine admiration for Rivera's technical achievement and artistic vision. He acknowledged that the work was powerful and important. Then he asked Rivera to remove the portrait of Lenin. The request was framed as a practical matter. Nelson explained that the portrait had become a source of public controversy that was damaging the reputation of Rockefeller Center and complicating the leasing of office space in the building. He did not frame the request as censorship. He framed it as a reasonable accommodation. Surely Rivera could replace one face with another without compromising the integrity of the composition. The letter was polite, it was warm, and it was an ultimatum dressed in velvet. Rivera received the letter and understood its implications. He did not write his reply alone. According to historian Daniel Okrent and other accounts, the response dated May 6th was largely drafted by Ben Shahn, the assistant most fiercely opposed to any compromise. Shahn was a committed leftist who saw the Lenin portrait as the mural's most important statement, and who believed that removing it would constitute a surrender to exactly the capitalist forces the painting was meant to challenge. The reply was conciliatory in tone but absolute in substance. Rivera declined to remove Lenin. He explained that a figure of a revolutionary leader had been implicit in his original concept from the beginning. He offered a compromise. He would add a portrait of Abraham Lincoln on the opposite side of the mural, creating a visual balance between two great historical figures. He also offered to include portraits of American heroes like the abolitionist Nat Turner, John Brown, or Harriet Beecher Stowe, but he would not erase Lenin. In a passage that would prove grimly prophetic, Rivera wrote, "Rather than mutilate the conception, I should prefer the physical destruction of the conception in its entirety, but preserving at least its integrity." He expected Nelson to negotiate. He expected the Rockefellers to appreciate the artistic logic of his compromise. He did not understand that the letter was no longer passing between an artist and a patron. It was passing between Nelson and his father. John D. Rockefeller Jr. read the situation through an entirely different lens. He did not see an artistic dispute. He saw an existential threat to 20 years of reputation rebuilding. The name Rockefeller had been dragged through Ludlow. It had been dragged through the antitrust hearings. Every hospital, every university, every dollar given to every charity had been part of a decades-long campaign to make the name mean something other than broken strikes and burning tents. And now a communist painter, paid with Rockefeller money, working in a Rockefeller building, had put the face of Vladimir Lenin on the Rockefeller wall. Every day it remained was a headline. Every headline was Ludlow again. Nelson may have wanted to negotiate. Jr. wanted it over. On the evening of May 10, 1933, Rivera was working on the scaffold when a manager approached and informed him that his services were no longer required. He was handed a check for the balance of his fee, the full $21,000. Then 12 uniformed security guards escorted him from the building. His assistants were ordered to stop. Their tools were confiscated. The scaffold was dismantled. Large canvas sheets were draped over the mural, hiding it from the public. Rivera stood on the sidewalk outside Rockefeller Center and faced the press. He was defiant. He called the act censorship. He called it vandalism. He said the mural belonged to the people, regardless of who had paid for it. Inside the building, the canvas hung over the painting like a burial shroud. The figures beneath it, the worker at his machine, the marching soldiers, the broken gods, the face of Lenin among the clasped hands of the workers, stared at the back of the cloth in the dark. The building opened late. The lobby was incomplete. The most expensive private construction project in American history had a hole in its heart, a 63-foot rectangle of canvas hiding 63 feet of unwanted truth. No one was willing to say what would happen next, but the plaster was dry, the chemistry had set, the portrait of Lenin was bonded to the wall at the molecular level, and the only way to remove it was to destroy the wall itself. The Rockefellers now faced a choice that no amount of money could make easy. The mural could stay covered, a permanent embarrassment hidden behind cloth, or it could be removed, which everyone now understood meant destroyed. Either way, they would lose. The question was only what kind of losing they preferred. Chapter 7. 9 months behind a canvas shroud. For 9 months, the most controversial painting in America hung in the most expensive lobby in the world, and nobody was allowed to see it. The canvas went up on the night of May 10th. It would not come down until February 9th of the following year. In between, the mural existed in a state of limbo that satisfied no one, too important to ignore, too dangerous to reveal, and too bonded to the wall to move. The Rockefellers had silenced the painting without solving the problem. They had bought time. But time in a half-empty building bleeding money during a depression was the one thing they could not afford. The financial pressure was relentless. Rockefeller Center's office towers were struggling to attract tenants in an economy where businesses were closing, not expanding. The original 14 buildings contained millions of square feet of leasable space. Filling that space required corporate confidence, and corporate confidence in 1933 was a rare commodity. Every prospective tenant who walked through the lobby of the RCA building encountered a 63-foot canvas wall where a mural should have been. It was not a good look. It suggested disorder. It suggested controversy. It suggested that the Rockefellers could not control their own building. The economic context made the situation unbearable. In 1933, 25% of the American workforce was unemployed. Industrial production had fallen by nearly half since 1929. Bank failures had wiped out the savings of millions. Bread lines stretched around city blocks. Into this landscape of ruin, the Rockefellers had poured over $100 million to build an Art Deco monument to American enterprise. The gamble had always been that the buildings would attract tenants whose rent would eventually cover the staggering cost. But tenants needed reasons to lease. A lobby draped in controversy canvas was not a reason, it was a warning. Junior's financial exposure was personal. He had financed the construction through a $65 million mortgage and the sale of his own Standard Oil shares at devastating losses. He was paying Columbia University $3 million per year in ground rent, regardless of whether the buildings were occupied. The interest payments alone ran into the millions. Every empty floor represented not just lost revenue, but active bleeding. Covered mural was not merely an aesthetic embarrassment, it was a financial wound. Behind closed doors, the family and their advisors debated options. John R. Todd, the managing agent for the construction project, proposed a solution in December of 1933, moved the mural to the Museum of Modern Art. The idea had a certain elegance. The museum, co-founded by Abby Rockefeller, could present the mural as an art object rather than a political provocation. Rivera could be credited, the controversy could be resolved. The wall could receive a new, safer commission. Rockefeller Center Inc. agreed to the proposal. Then they discovered it was impossible. The problem was the 3/4-inch plastering code. When Rivera and White had requested a metal substructure behind the plaster, a structure that would have allowed the mural to be detached from the wall as a single unit, the construction managers had refused. The plaster had been applied directly to the wall at the standard building code thickness. There was no backing, no support frame, no way to slide a blade between the painting and the building. The fresco was the wall was the fresco. Rivera had known this from the beginning. He had requested the removable structure precisely because he anticipated something like this. The denial of that request, which had seemed like a routine construction decision at the time, now revealed itself as the detail that sealed the mural's fate. The physics were unforgiving. True fresco plaster, once bonded and dried, cannot be peeled away in one piece without a rigid backing. Cutting it into sections would destroy the continuity of the composition and risk shattering the brittle lime plaster. The Todd proposal, however well-intentioned, was a fantasy. The mural could not be saved, it could only be hidden or destroyed. Meanwhile, the mural's existence behind the canvas became a cause. Artists, intellectuals, and labor activists protested. Walter Pack, George Biddle, Rockwell Kent, H.L. Mencken, and Lewis Mumford were among those who appealed to the Rockefellers to preserve the work. Demonstrations were organized, letters were written. The Communist Party, which had expelled Rivera years earlier, now championed him as a martyr of capitalist censorship. The irony was rich. Rivera, who had been attacked by the communists for taking Rockefeller money, was now being defended by them for having the money taken away. But protests do not pay rent. Every week that the mural remained covered, the building's vacancy problem worsened. The canvas did not just hide a painting, it advertised a failure. Potential tenants saw it and calculated risk. A building that could not manage an art commission might not manage anything else. The Rockefellers had built a 14-building complex to prove that American capitalism could build the future even in a depression. The covered mural suggested that the future might not cooperate. Raymond Hood, the lead architect, publicly stated that the mural would receive very careful handling. Two possible outcomes were floated: that the painting might be screened temporarily by a canvas mural, or that it might be removed, plaster and all, for preservation elsewhere. Both statements proved to be false. The canvas screen was not temporary, the removal was not possible. The only real option was the one no one wanted to announce publicly, because announcing it would generate exactly the kind of headlines that had caused the problem in the first place. 9 months is a long time to make a decision that everyone already knows the answer to. The Rockefellers were not delaying out of indecision. They were delaying because the act they were contemplating, the deliberate destruction of a major artwork in their own building, was the kind of thing that Ludlow had taught them to avoid. It would look like power exercised without conscience. It would look like the burning of tents, translated into the burning of art. But the money was running out, and the wall was not getting any less communist. Chapter 8. The night they came with chisels. They did not peel it carefully or cut it in sections, or treat it as something that had once been beautiful. On the night of February 9, 1934, a Saturday, trucks pulled up outside Rockefeller Center. Workers entered the RCA building through a service entrance, avoiding the main lobby doors. They built a new scaffold in front of the canvas-covered wall. They brought chisels, hammers, and scrapers. And then, working through the night and into the small hours of the morning, they destroyed man at the crossroads. The process was methodical and total. The workers chiseled into the plaster surface, breaking through the fresco layer and prying it from the underlying wall in chunks. There was no attempt at preservation, no effort to save even a fragment for study or historical record. The pigment that Rivera had ground into wet lime plaster, the colors he had chosen to represent capitalism's wars and socialism's promise, and the lonely worker at the center of it all, broke apart into dust and rubble. The faces disintegrated, the broken gods crumbled, the lenses through which Rivera had painted humanity peering into the infinitely large and infinitely small shattered into meaningless shards. The portrait of Lenin, the face that had triggered the crisis, was reduced to powder indistinguishable from the rest. The pieces were shoveled into oil drums. By chance, the following Sunday afternoon, Lucienne Bloch and her boyfriend Stephen Dimitrov were walking past Rockefeller Center after watching a matinee and noticed a cluster of drums sitting near a locked entrance. They looked inside and recognized fragments of plaster bearing traces of their master's brushwork. Stunned, they picked up some of the pieces. Then they ran to a telephone to call the press and to reach Rivera in Mexico City. Commuters arriving at the building on Monday morning were met by the smell of fresh plaster and a blank wall rising above them where the mural had been. 63 feet of art, 17 feet high gone in its place. Nothing. A smooth, white, freshly plastered surface that said absolutely nothing about anything. The mathematics of destruction are worth pausing over. Rivera had spent months creating 1,071 square feet of true fresco. He had applied thousands of individual brushstrokes, each one permanent, each one bonded chemically to the lime plaster. His assistants had ground pigments, mixed plaster batches, prepared wall sections, and worked alongside him through grueling days that sometimes stretched past midnight. The total labor invested in the mural, counting Rivera and his 6-person crew, amounted to hundreds of person days of skilled artistic work. The workmen who destroyed it finished in a single night. Creation takes months, destruction takes hours. That asymmetry is the fundamental fact of every act of vandalism ever committed, from burning libraries to demolishing murals. Rockefeller Center, Inc. issued a press release. It was 2 sentences long. It said that the walls had been replastered. It did not use the word destroyed. It did not use the word mural. It did not acknowledge that anything of value had been lost. 2 sentences for 63 feet of fresco. 2 sentences for one of the most important public artworks ever created in America. The brevity was not accidental. The less said, the less quoted. The less quoted, the sooner forgotten. That was the calculation. Rivera reached in Mexico, responded with public fury and private devastation. He issued statements calling the destruction an act of cultural vandalism and an assault on artistic freedom. He compared it to book burning. He said the destruction would advance the cause of the labor revolution, because it proved that the ruling class feared art more than it feared armies. But those who knew him closely said the bravado concealed real grief. The mural had been incomplete when he was removed from the scaffold. He had never finished the lower section, the plant forms emerging from their roots in the soil that represented the controlled growth of natural resources. The painting he had poured months of exhausting labor into, working 15-hour days on scaffolding in a cold lobby, was gone, not relocated, not preserved behind canvas, gone. But one thing survived: Lucienne Bloch's photographs. Weeks before Rivera was expelled, suspecting that the controversy might lead to the mural's destruction, Rivera had asked Bloch to document the painting. Building security had blocked formal photography, so Bloch had concealed a small camera and taken pictures quickly, furtively, between moments when guards were not watching. The resulting images were black and white, imperfect, shot from angles dictated by opportunity rather than composition. They were also the only visual evidence that man at the crossroads had ever existed. Those photographs, taken by a young woman with a hidden camera in a guarded lobby, became the sole surviving record of a 63-foot painting in the most expensive building in America. The Rockefellers had destroyed the wall. They could not destroy the pictures. And the pictures would prove more powerful than the wall, because a photograph of something destroyed carries a weight that the original, had it survived, might never have possessed. The image of a lost thing is always more haunting than the thing itself. The Rockefellers had made their choice. They had chosen a blank wall over an honest picture. They had preferred silence to an argument they could not win. The question now was whether the silence would hold. It would not. Chapter 9: The Revenge Painted in Mexico City. Rivera used Rockefeller's own money to paint the mural again, and this time he added syphilis. After the destruction of man at the crossroads, Rivera returned to Mexico carrying something the Rockefellers could not chisel away: the memory of every line, every color, every figure in the composition he had spent months creating. He also carried Bloch's photographs, and he carried the balance of his $21,000 fee, which the Rockefellers had paid in full despite firing him. Out of that sum, $6,300 had gone to his agent's commission. Roughly $8,000 covered materials and assistants' wages. Rivera was left with less than $7,000. But it was enough. It was, as he later pointed out with satisfaction, Rockefeller money, and he intended to spend it on something that would make the Rockefellers deeply uncomfortable. Within months, Rivera secured a commission from the Mexican government to paint a mural on the walls of the Palacio de Bellas Artes, the newly completed fine arts palace in Mexico City. The subject would be the same, the composition would be almost identical, the title would be different: Man, Controller of the Universe. But this version would include additions that the Rockefeller Center original had never contained. Additions that transformed the recreation from an act of artistic preservation into an act of calculated revenge. The first and most significant change involved the right side of the mural. In the original, Rivera had painted Lenin among the marching workers. In the recreation, he kept Lenin and added Leon Trotsky standing alongside Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. This was not merely a political gesture, it was a personal one. Rivera was a Trotskyist by temperament, and including Trotsky alongside Marx made the painting more explicitly aligned with his own ideological position. It also made the painting more dangerous within the internal politics of the Soviet left, where Trotsky was already being systematically erased by Stalin's regime. Rivera was picking fights on multiple fronts simultaneously. It was his natural state. The second edition was more intimate and more vicious. On the left side of the composition, in the nightclub scene representing capitalist decadence, Rivera had originally painted generic wealthy figures at leisure. In the recreation, he painted a specific face among them, John D. Rockefeller Jr., and he did not paint Jr. in a flattering light. He depicted the scion of the richest family in America sitting in a nightclub with a glass in his hand. Floating in the air inches from his face, rendered with the biological precision of a medical illustration, were bacteria, specifically the spirochete that causes syphilis. The insult was multi-layered. It associated the Rockefeller name with sexual disease. It placed Jr. in a scene of decadent idleness, the precise opposite of the industrious, devout, philanthropic image he had spent decades constructing. And it was painted on the wall of a national palace, visible to anyone who entered. Rivera had taken Rockefeller's money, used it to recreate the painting Rockefeller had destroyed, and then added a portrait of Rockefeller himself surrounded by venereal bacteria. It was petty. It was brilliant. It was preserved in the permanent collection of the Mexican government, beyond the reach of any American chisel. The Palacio de Bellas Artes mural was completed on November 29, 1934, the day the museum opened to the public. The composition was slightly smaller than the original 15 feet 9 inches by 37 feet 6 inches, compared to the Rockefeller version's 17 by 63. But it was complete. Rivera finished the lower section that had been left undone in New York, the plant forms emerging from the soil, the biological imagery of growth and regeneration. For the first time, the full vision was visible. Back in the United States, the destruction of the mural had triggered a protest wave that extended well beyond the art world. Artists boycotted Rockefeller Center commissions. Ralph Stackpole and Bernard Zackheim created paintings featuring newspapers with headlines referencing the controversy. The Communist New Workers' School in Manhattan, led by Rivera's associate Bertram Wolfe, organized demonstrations. Rivera painted 21 frescoes as a gift to the school in gratitude for their protests. The scale of the reaction surprised the Rockefellers. They had expected the story to fade. Instead, it was growing. The political aftershocks reached the White House. President Franklin Roosevelt, who had launched the New Deal and was already considering federal programs to employ artists, watched the Rivera controversy with private anxiety. If a private patron like Rockefeller could destroy a publicly visible artwork for political reasons, what would happen when the government itself began funding artists? The question was not hypothetical. Within a year, the Works Progress Administration would begin commissioning murals across the country. The Rivera affair became an unspoken cautionary tale about what happens when money and art disagree about what the future should look like. For John D. Rockefeller Jr., the affair ended with a decree. No artwork would ever again be installed in Rockefeller Center without his personal approval. The mural that replaced Man at the Crossroads was painted by José María Sert, a Catalan artist whose work was decorative, monochromatic, and politically inert. Sert's painting, titled American Progress, depicted muscular figures straining heroically in sepia tones. It offended no one. It challenged nothing. It said exactly what the Rockefellers wanted said about the future, that it was being built by strong men, that it required no particular ideology, and that it looked best in a single, safe, brownish gold. The contrast told its own story. Rivera had painted a choice between two worlds and demanded that the viewer decide. Sert painted effort without direction, strength without purpose, motion without destination. The safe mural replaced the dangerous one. The wall was finally permanently silent. But the silence itself was an answer, and the answer was, you do not destroy what cannot hurt you. Chapter 10, The Wall That Remembers Nothing. If you walk into the lobby of 30 Rockefeller Plaza today, there is no plaque, no marker, no indication that anything was ever destroyed there. The building stands as it has stood for nearly a century, limestone and steel and glass, rising 70 stories above Midtown Manhattan. The lobby is polished, the elevators run. The tourists flow through in reliable streams, heading for the observation deck or the NBC studios or the ice rink in the plaza below. José María Sert's American Progress still occupies the Great Wall, its sepia figures straining in muscular anonymity. If you did not know the history, you would assume the mural had always been there. That is the point. The Rockefeller family's direct involvement in the complex ended gradually and then completely. In 2000, Tishman Speyer purchased Rockefeller Center for $1.85 billion, a price that would have covered the original construction cost nearly 20 times over. The Rockefeller family sold their remaining shares in the property in 2014. The name remains on the buildings. The family does not. The fortune that built the center has dispersed across generations, foundations, and trusts. The direct line from Standard Oil to the RCA building lobby is now a matter of history rather than ownership. The physical erasure is total. No interpretive sign explains what once hung on the lobby wall. No museum display commemorates the controversy. Visitors can stand on the exact spot where Rivera's scaffold stood and have no idea that they are standing in the location of one of the most consequential acts of artistic destruction in American history. The building's official literature mentions its Art Deco design, its place in the New York skyline, its role as the home of NBC. It does not mention Diego Rivera. It does not mention chisels. The complex itself has prospered. As of recent years, it was reported to be 93% leased. The ice rink still operates every winter, drawing thousands of skaters who glide beneath the golden Prometheus statue without thinking about the labor disputes or artistic scandals of the building's youth. The Christmas tree still rises every November, a tradition that began accidentally in 1931 when construction workers decorated a small tree with paper and tin cans, and that has since grown into one of the most watched annual rituals in American life. By the 1960s, the trees were 6 stories high, requiring 24 electricians working 10 days to string 5 miles of wire and over 1,000 illuminated ornaments. The spectacle is so thoroughly wholesome that it has erased every trace of the building's troubled origin. The transformation of Rockefeller Center from a desperate Depression-era gamble into a permanent fixture of New York City life is itself a lesson in what money can buy. The complex that once bled revenue is now one of the most valuable real estate holdings in Manhattan. The buildings that Jr. financed by selling depreciated oil shares at $2 each now command rents that would have been unimaginable in 1933. The 22 acres between 5th and 6th Avenues have their own zip codes, their own subway station, and an underground concourse connecting the buildings. Over 17 million square feet of leasable space generates revenue that dwarfs the original construction cost many times over every decade. Rockefeller Center has become so thoroughly woven into the fabric of New York City life that its origins in crisis, in Depression-era desperation, and one man's need to redeem a tainted name have been paved over by decades of normalcy. The building won, or rather the building's purpose won. It was meant to prove that capitalism could build beautiful things. It proved it. The question of what those beautiful things were allowed to say was settled on the night of February 9, 1934, and the settlement has never been revisited. Surt's replacement mural endures. Critics have never loved it. Art historians describe it as competent but unremarkable, a painting that exists to fill a space rather than to make an argument. It does precisely what the Rockefellers needed it to do after the Rivera disaster. It decorates without provoking. It occupies the wall without claiming the wall. It is the visual equivalent of hold music. You notice it. You do not think about it. You certainly do not send anyone with chisels to destroy it. And that, for the Rockefellers, was the whole point. But absence has its own kind of presence. The blank space where a plaque should be is itself a statement. The decision not to commemorate the destruction is a continuation of the destruction. It says this did not happen here. It says there is nothing to remember. It says the wall has always been this way. And every tourist who passes through the lobby without knowing what was lost proves that the strategy worked. The question is whether working is the same as winning. Chapter 11. The art that outlived its own murder. The mural Diego Rivera painted in Mexico City has now been seen by more people than ever walked through the lobby of Rockefeller Center. Man, controller of the universe, hangs in the Palacio de Bellas Artes, the white marble palace that anchors the cultural heart of Mexico City. It occupies a wall on the 2nd floor, visible from the moment you reach the top of the grand staircase. It is enormous. The colors preserved in true fresco for over 90 years are vivid, reds and golds and the deep green of growing things. The worker at the center still operates his machine. The lenses still reveal the cosmic and the microscopic. The soldiers still march in their gas masks. And Vladimir Lenin still stands among the workers, his hand clasped with people of every race, his face clear and unmistakable. The painting has become one of the essential works of the Mexican mural movement, alongside the great series by Rivera's contemporaries José Clemente Orozco and David Alfaro Siqueiros. It draws hundreds of thousands of visitors every year, far more than the number who pass through the lobby of 30 Rockefeller Plaza with any awareness of what once hung there. School children file past it on field trips. Art students study its composition. Tourists from around the world photograph it, though they are not supposed to, and share those images across the internet. The painting is alive in a way that its original, had it survived in a New York office lobby, might never have been. This is the paradox that the Rockefellers created. By destroying the mural, they made it immortal. Had Man at the Crossroads survived in the RCA building lobby, it would have become a piece of corporate decoration admired by some, ignored by most, gradually absorbed into the background of daily life. Office workers would have walked past it for decades without pausing. It would have been famous but familiar, which in the art world is almost the same as invisible. The destruction changed everything. It turned a lobby mural into a martyr. It gave the painting a story that was more powerful than the painting itself. The films helped. Tim Robbins' Cradle Will Rock in 1999 dramatized the Rivera-Rockefeller conflict as part of a broader story about art and politics during the Depression. Julie Taymor's Frida in 2002, starring Salma Hayek, included a vivid scene of Rivera shouting at Rockefeller from the scaffold. The scene, whether historically accurate in its details or not, cemented the confrontation in popular memory as a fable about power and creativity. Rivera shouts, "It is my painting." Rockefeller replies, "It is my wall." The exchange is probably fictional. The truth it contains is not. Exhibitions have kept the controversy current. In 2014, the Mexican Cultural Institute in Washington, D.C. mounted Man at the Crossroads, Diego Rivera's mural at Rockefeller Center, which assembled the original sketches, correspondence, photographs, and documents from both sides. Lucien Bloch's black and white photographs, taken with a concealed camera in a guarded lobby, were displayed as both historical evidence and works of art in their own right. The photographs that building security tried to prevent became the centerpiece of a museum show 8 decades later. The story has even entered the realm of popular television. An episode of The Simpsons loosely retold the commissioning and destruction of the fresco, extending the controversy's reach into the most unlikely corners of American culture. The scholarly attention has been equally persistent. Hayden Herrera's 1983 biography of Frida Kahlo documented how Kahlo herself viewed the affair, writing that one could fight against the Rockefellers without being stabbed in the back, a reference to the strange courtesy that Nelson and Rivera maintained even after the destruction. Carrie Reich's biography of Nelson Rockefeller described the controversy as evidence of Nelson's princely tendency to have surrogates handle his dirty work. Daniel Okrent's 2004 book Great Fortune devoted extensive chapters to the mural affair, placing it within the broader story of Rockefeller Center's development. The scholarship continues because the questions continue. No one has improved on Rivera's Sistine Chapel formulation. Rivera lost the wall. He won the century. The destruction, intended to silence the art, became the reason the world remembers it. The Rockefellers got their blank wall, their safe replacement, their uncontroversial lobby. Rivera got everything else: the story, the sympathy, the cultural legacy, and the permanent presence of his painting in a national palace where no American billionaire can touch it. Nelson Rockefeller, it should be noted, continued to collect Rivera's work after ordering the mural's destruction. He knew the art was extraordinary. He simply could not tolerate it on his father's wall. The lesson is not that art always wins. Art does not always win. Countless murals, paintings, sculptures, and buildings have been destroyed by power and forgotten entirely. What makes the Rivera case different is that the destruction was public, the artist famous, and the photographs survived. The Rockefellers destroyed the painting but could not destroy the evidence that it had existed. And the evidence, over time, proved more durable than the plaster. Chapter 12, Who owns the story on the wall? Rivera once asked a question no one has answered. If someone buys the Sistine Chapel, does he have the right to destroy it? The legal answer in 1934 and for decades afterward was unambiguous. The Rockefellers owned the wall. They had commissioned the painting. They had paid the artist his full fee. They had the legal right to do whatever they wished with their property, including reducing it to dust. No law in the United States at that time protected an artwork from its owner. The wall belonged to the Rockefellers. What was on the wall belonged to the Rockefellers. If they wanted it gone, it was gone. The moral question is more complicated, and it has not been settled in the 90 years since the chisels came out. Rivera's position was that art, once created, transcends the transaction that brought it into being. A patron may pay for a painting, but the painting, once it exists, belongs to something larger than the patron's bank account. It belongs to the culture. It belongs to the public who sees it. It belongs to the future that will study it. To destroy it is to steal from everyone who would have seen it and been changed by it. The patron bought a wall. The artist made a window. Destroying the window does not destroy what it looked out on. The Rockefellers' position, never stated so directly but implicit in every action they took, was that ownership includes the right of destruction. A man who builds a $100 million complex does not forfeit control of his own lobby to a painter with a contract. The building was the Rockefellers' argument about the future. The mural contradicted that argument. To compel them to display an argument they rejected in a building they built was to deny them the very freedom they believed their wealth entitled them to exercise. They did not see the destruction as censorship. They saw it as editing. Both positions contain truth. Both positions are incomplete, and the incompleteness is the point. The Rivera-Rockefeller affair endures in cultural memory not because it was resolved, but because it was not. Every generation that revisits it discovers the same unresolvable tension, that great art requires patronage, and patronage requires power, and power, when it pays for a mirror, does not always like what it sees. The system that produced the Rockefeller fortune, Standard Oil's monopoly, the breakup that multiplied the wealth, the philanthropy that laundered the name, the construction project that employed 40,000 workers during a depression, was the same system that produced the mural and then destroyed it. Capital built the wall. Capital hired the painter. Capital approved the sketch. And capital, when the sketch became a painting that told an unwelcome truth, sent men with chisels in the night. The system cannot be separated from either the creation or the destruction. They are the same act viewed from different sides of the canvas. This is the pattern that repeats across centuries. The Medicis funded Michelangelo and also funded wars. The pharaohs built temples and also built them with slave labor. Every civilization that has produced great art has also produced the conditions that great art feels compelled to challenge. The patron wants a mirror that flatters. The artist makes a mirror that reveals, and when the reflection is too honest, the patron smashes the glass and commissions a new mirror from a more agreeable craftsman. The CERT mural in the lobby of 30 Rockefeller Plaza is that new mirror. It reflects nothing. It reveals nothing. It hangs on the wall like a certificate of good behavior, proof that the building has learned its lesson and will never again invite an honest painter through its doors. Rivera's Sistine Chapel question remains unanswered because it asks something that our legal and moral systems are not designed to resolve. At what point does a created thing become more important than the person who paid for it? We have no formula for this. We have no court that adjudicates the rights of beauty against the rights of property. We have only the recurring spectacle of the collision and the evidence it leaves behind. Consider what survives. In New York, the lobby of 30 Rockefeller Plaza holds a painting no one talks about by an artist few remember, depicting nothing that anyone finds threatening. The ice rink still runs. The tourists still come. The building is worth billions. In Mexico City, the Palacio de Bellas Artes holds the painting that was supposed to be destroyed by an artist the world has not forgotten, depicting a choice that humanity has still not made. School children stand before it and argue about what it means. Art students copy its forms. The syphilis bacteria still float near Rockefeller's painted face. The Rockefellers won the wall. Rivera won the story. And the final irony, the one that neither side could have predicted in 1934, is that the story was always worth more than the wall, because walls crumble. Stories compound. A wall is a thing you own. A story is a thing that owns you. You do not send men with chisels after something that cannot hurt you. The Rockefellers sent men with chisels. And 90 years later, the thing they tried to destroy is the only reason we remember the wall at all.